New York City, January 2023. A man steps out of an office building on 5th Avenue. He is 6'4", heavy-set, wearing a charcoal coat that swallows his frame. He looks like any other architect navigating the Midtown rush. He stops at a trash can, tosses a cardboard pizza box inside, and disappears into the crowd. He doesn't know that eyes are on him. He doesn't know that within minutes, investigators will be fishing that box out of the bin. On a single, half-eaten crust lies the genetic blueprint of a monster. For 13 years, he was a ghost haunting the South Shore of Long Island. Now, he's just a man who didn't finish his lunch. The silence of Gilgo Beach is about to be broken forever. In May 2010, the wind off the Atlantic was cold enough to bite. A young woman named Shanann Gilbert was running through the gated community of Oak Beach, screaming for her life. She was a Craigslist escort who had vanished into the marsh after a frantic 911 call. When the Suffolk County Police Department finally sent K-9 units to search the thick brambles along Ocean Parkway, they weren't looking for a serial killer. They were looking for a missing person. But the dogs didn't find Shanann. Instead, they found a skeletal foot. Then a skull. Then another. Within days, 4 bodies were uncovered, all wrapped in camouflaged burlap, spaced exactly 500 feet apart. They were Megan Waterman, Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Amber Lynn Costello, and Melissa Barthelemy. They became known as the Gilgo Four. They were young, they were mothers, sisters, and daughters, and they had all been discarded like refuse in the brush. The realization paralyzed the island. A predator was using the desolate stretch of highway as his personal graveyard, a place where the tide and the salt would swallow his secrets. But the investigation stalled. Corruption, apathy, and a police department in turmoil allowed the trail to go cold while the killer sat in his living room, watching the news. Stories like this one almost never see the light of day. If you want more buried history, subscribe to Crime and Century. We dig up what others leave behind. The mystery of the Long Island serial killer became a dark legend. For a decade, the case was a graveyard of leads. There were whispers of high-ranking officials involved in cover-ups and theories about a doctor living in the dunes. But in 2022, a new task force took the reins, looking at the evidence with fresh, desperate eyes. They went back to the very beginning. They looked at a witness statement from 2010 that had been buried in the files. A witness had seen a towering ogre of a man driving a first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche. They searched vehicle records for that specific, outdated truck. They found one registered to a man living in Massapequa Park, directly across the bay from the dump site. His name was Rex Heuermann. He was a successful Manhattan architect, a father, a neighbor. He was the man next door. The task force began a shadow operation, tailing Heuermann through the streets of Manhattan and the suburbs of Long Island. They watched him use burner phones to contact sex workers. They tracked his internet history, discovering a sickening obsession with torture and the very victims he was suspected of killing. He was living a double life of terrifying precision. He would leave his ramshackle red house in the morning, take the Long Island Railroad into the city, design skyscrapers, and then spend his nights descending into the darkest corners of the human psyche. The tension was a wire stretched to the breaking point. They had the truck, they had the cell tower pings that put him in the same locations as the victims, but they needed the one thing that would hold up in a court of law. They needed his DNA. That brings us back to the pizza crust. While Heuermann was working in his Midtown office, forensic teams were busy analyzing hair found on the burlap sacks from 2010. Those hairs didn't belong to the killer, they belonged to his wife. She had been out of town during each murder, but her DNA had traveled on her husband's clothes. When the lab compared the DNA from the discarded pizza crust in Manhattan to the mitochondrial DNA found on the victims, the odds of it being anyone else were 1 in millions. On July 13, 2023, the ogre was finally cornered. Rex Heuermann was arrested on a sidewalk in Midtown Manhattan, looking stunned as the handcuffs clicked shut. The man who thought he was smarter than the world, who had lived for years in a house filled with hundreds of firearms just miles from his victim's resting place, was finally unmasked. The basement of his home was a labyrinth of secrets, a place where investigators spent weeks digging for more evidence of his depravity. He had walked among us, a monster in a suit, confident that the brambles of Gilgo Beach would keep his secret forever. But he forgot one thing. The earth eventually yields its dead, and even a discarded crust can carry the weight of justice. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to know the truth. And leave a comment. Which detail hit you hardest? The hunt for the truth is over, but the shadows he left behind will never truly fade.